Hello, dear friends. You're on the Ruslan Belov channel, and this is the daily analysis of the Ukrainian front of military operations. Well, negotiations continue. Yesterday, the Russian delegation met with the Ukrainian one in Abu Dhabi. There's no concrete details yet, but it's known that next week Stephen Witkoff and David Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, will come to Moscow, and they will try to persuade, as I understand, Putin to agree to a peace plan already modified by Ukraine and Europe. I'll tell you my forecast. If this plan lacks the withdrawal of the armed forces of Ukraine from Donetsk Oblast, if this plan lacks Ukraine's refusal to join NATO, then of course Putin will politely say goodbye to them and send them back with nothing. Russia will not accept such terms. Well, battles on the front continue, and we continue to study the situation. So friends, diplomacy has its own front, but here's the real front, and Russian fighters continue to reduce Ukraine's territory on a daily basis. Let's start today, perhaps, with Kherson Oblast. I want to clarify one point, because in the comments they keep asking me, do Russian fighters really control something in the Korabel micro-district? Well, listen, all of this is nonsense. It appeared a month ago, and now someone started inventing again that Russian troops are on the right bank of the Dnipro, and that they're clearing something in Kherson and controlling something there. Here, the line of combat contact hasn't changed and isn't changing, and in the near future, even if the war continues, it won't change. Maximum landing on islands, and even that was, in 2023 and 2024. Now, no one even does that, since such operations don't lead to anything substantial except unnecessary losses. Therefore, when you hear such fake news, with 99% probability, it's fake. No one will force the Dnipro now. No one will storm Kherson now. The Dnipro grouping basically doesn't have such forces to conduct such operations. So forget about the fake news from various garbage sources, don't believe it. Now that we've clarified this point, let's go to the real front, not the fantasy one, and to real advances. Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. In the zone of responsibility of the Vostok grouping, there were no advances in the past day, but the center grouping improved positions in the area of Novopavlivka. Not in the village itself, but in the pocket between the village and the administrative border of Donetsk Oblast. The depth of advance here was 2.5 kilometers. Well, and as you can see, there's still room to move, at minimum up to the Muravka-Novopavlivka highway. Regarding Novopavlivka itself, they got bogged down, which was actually expected. The village is large. I've even already given you statistics that Novopavlivka is even bigger than cities like, for example, Selidov or Soledar. I mean not by population, but by the area of the settlement. And, therefore, to take the entire settlement completely in one rush, as Russian troops tried, there was little chance. Yes, as a result, they managed to grab even more than half of the settlement. But the armed forces of Ukraine eventually came to their senses after the initial shock and dug in. And the Russian army doesn't have enough strength yet to finish off the city completely. So there are viscous battles for every homestead, and sometimes one house or another changes hands several times. In general, heavy fighting in residential areas. To finish off, undoubtedly, Russian troops will eventually finish off Novopavlivka. Considering how much was taken under control here, considering the configuration of the front, the armed forces of Ukraine's chances to hold Novopavlivka are not just small, they're non-existent. It's only a question of timing when this will happen. Moving on, to the Pokrovsk-Myrnohrad sector. The hottest battles are around Kherson, and I'm forced to state that the Russian army hasn't yet managed to enter and consolidate in the village. The armed forces of Ukraine are using Kherson as a support and accumulation point for subsequent counterattacks on Pokrovsk. And counterattacks, understand, they conduct daily. At the same time, they don't achieve success, they die, but command continues to send them to slaughter. Apparently, an order came from Kiev to retake Pokrovsk. They throw trained soldiers into such counterattacks, and the Russian command uses this moment with maximum benefit, since these trained soldiers usually don't participate in defense, but here they climb out themselves, and the destruction of such forces is the most important task for Russian command. One can say that such development of events is very beneficial for the Russian side. Counterattacking such a large city is very difficult, just as entering such a city initially is extremely difficult. As for the Russian side, Russian troops tried to get a foothold around Kherson several times, but it didn't work out. But there are serious successes for the Russian army in Myrnohrad. They managed to do what was intended by command from the very beginning, namely to cut Myrnohrad into two parts, completely isolating the southern part of the city from the main one. Well, and as you can see, this is done. Credit to the 5th Guards Brigade. What was accomplished here? They managed to take under full control Kechenko, 8th of March, Razin and Senaya streets, plus part of Pushkin Street, part of Gogol and Nekrasov streets, including the church. Plus, they advanced a bit more in the western micro-district, clearing 4 more apartment buildings. But here, as you can see, there still remains a powerful armed forces of Ukraine fortification in the form of School Number 9 and 6 more apartment buildings before reaching the western outskirts of the micro-district. I'm in contact with the 5th Brigade, and they say that the final clearing of the entire southern part of Myrnohrad is already being conducted. That is, in theory, you can say that the entire southern part of Myrnohrad is in any case already practically controlled by the Russian army. And I even saw that some cartographers are coloring the entire southern part of Myrnohrad as full Russian control. At the same time, no, there's not exactly 100% control, since the armed forces of Ukraine are sitting there in basements, clearing is ongoing, but they're coloring it because it's clear that the fate of the southern part has already been decided. Like this part of the city, it's transitioning to full Russian control. And the fact that someone is hiding in basements, this won't affect the overall and final result anymore. Since, well, considering that the armed forces of Ukraine are completely isolated from the main part of the city, they won't be able to offer long resistance here. Plus, as you can see on the map, they also managed to advance south of the city along the railway tracks. They advanced here 1 kilometer 300 meters. As for the main part of Myrnohrad, Russian aviation is working densely with FABs. Armed forces of Ukraine fighters are complaining that Russian aerospace forces are simply erasing all the apartment buildings to dust, actively using FAB 3000. This is being done to avoid getting involved in long, exhausting battles for blocks of apartment buildings, of which there are many here. Instead, they're demolishing everything along with those who settled there. Information that the southern part is almost completely under control of Russian forces also comes from independent sources. Russian drone operators are organizing a real hunt for the remaining part of Ukrainian soldiers. It seems the count of their lives has gone to days if they don't surrender to Russian soldiers. Footage appeared from the central part of the city of Russian fighters taking prisoner a group of Ukrainian soldiers. It seems Ukrainian soldiers are beginning to understand that command abandoned them here, they're in a ring, and there will be no help anymore. There are only 2 ways out of this situation, either captivity or a black bag. Yesterday I told you that here in the ring is the Mykolaiv Brigade of the 79th Air Assault Brigade, one of the most elite and combat-capable groups of the Ukrainian army. Zelensky, what's happening is not for the first time, decided to sacrifice them to buy himself time, to look strong in negotiations with Trump, but we see that it's getting harder and harder for the armed forces of Ukraine with each month to hold the front. An American general who was recently in Kiev told Ukrainian leadership that Ukraine will lose Donetsk Oblast next year. The war is already lost, and they need to fix the results now, otherwise the stakes will grow more and more with each month. Zelensky, of course, will go to the end. If he gives up anything from Ukraine, it's the end for him. And Ukrainian soldiers are already directly hinting to him, if he surrenders anything, they're simply threatening to destroy him. Now let's return to the front. Also good news for the past day came from the sector above, from the Novopavlivka direction. Well, more like, there was both good news and not so good news, but there was more good. In particular, they managed to clear the pocket between the villages of Suketske and Suvorove, and also from Myrnohrad, advance 1 kilometer 700 meters to the railway tracks. Now what? And now it remains to liquidate this disgrace here. Well, and then, essentially, along the railway, there will be a full exit to the approaches to the city of Belitska, since from current positions to the city, it's less than 1.5 kilometers. That is, Russian diversionary reconnaissance groups in the near future will quite be able to start working already inside the city. Well, that's the perspective. And for now they managed to substantially improve positions here. If we move up a bit, the Russian army managed to advance in the industrial zone of Dorozhne. They advanced 450 meters. True, they also jumped into the northern part, but couldn't hold there, had to roll back. They also had to roll back from the eastern outskirts of Novyi Donbass. But actually, this news is outdated. That is, this didn't happen yesterday, but a couple of weeks ago. What else? Well, remember I told you about how the armed forces of Ukraine managed to take control of summer cottages southeast of Vilna, and even further south to advance. This was also a couple of weeks ago. Well, or even 3 weeks ago. I don't remember already. But it happened. I told you about it. So as a result, all their acquisitions the armed forces of Ukraine lost. Russian fighters managed to clear everything here, and they cleared the summer cottages sector too, and restored full control over previously lost territory. What's drawn to the north here? You can ignore this, since Russian troops withdrew from Zoloty Kolodez and Kucherev Yar a long time ago. Cartographers just dragged it out here for a very long time and only now drew that Kucherev Yar and Zoloty Kolodez are under armed forces of Ukraine control. They took it back. Although, as I say, Russian troops withdrew a long time ago, this news is very outdated. But what's interesting to us is what's happening in the area of Shakov. And here the trends for the armed forces of Ukraine are very bad. They started to sag in Shakov. Russian fighters managed to clear the pocket south of the village. The entire territory up to the Kazeny Torets River is controlled by the Russian army. Plus, they managed to enter and consolidate on the western outskirts of Shakov. Plus, to the north, they finished clearing part of Shakov that's beyond the river, well on the other, bank of the river, and even advanced a bit along the road towards Sofiivka. But the central part of Shakov is not yet under the Russian army. Control there belongs to the armed forces of Ukraine. However, if we look at the configuration of the front, we understand they won't last long here. So there's a chance that by the end of the month, the Russian army will finish off this long-suffering village. Well, or at least by the beginning of December. The battles here are heavy. Honestly, I don't remember for a long time when the armed forces of Ukraine dug in for a village like they're digging in for Shakov. Recently, if you pay attention, they surrender quite quickly, and there are no really prolonged battles specifically for villages. But here they dug in. On other sectors of the front, there were no updates for the past day. Well, only that the Ministry of Defense officially confirmed the taking of Ivanopilia on the Kostiantynivka direction, which we talked about several days ago, that fighters managed to finish off and take the village under control. Summing up the past day, 30.7 square kilometers of territory passed under control of the Russian army. There was another powerful strike on energy infrastructure. Moreover, aerospace forces rocket troops struck not only generation, but also substations through which electricity is supplied to Ukraine's power system from 3 nuclear power plants remaining under Kiev's control. The strike was combined: Kinzhals, Calibers, Koch 101s, Iskanders, Geraniums. By the way, it's very remarkable that the strike was delivered right after Ukrainian energy workers managed to restore the operation of their substations so much that the nuclear power plants again came out to full capacity. Also remarkable is the new tactic of delivering strikes, which Ukrainian publics write about. Previously, Geraniums always struck first, whose task was to take the first hit of air defense, and then missiles inflicted the main damage. Today, actions were performed exactly the opposite. Now about strikes on their own generation. In Kyiv, CHP-5 and CHP-6 were hit again. It seems the Russian command has a desire to shut down all of Kyiv's generation to zero. And also the Kyiv hydroelectric station and Kaniv hydroelectric station were hit. In Odessa, moreover, 4 Geraniums struck the Odessa CHP, which gives little electricity, but on which the city's heat supply hangs. Also traditionally, they struck military-industrial complex enterprises, warehouses, railway infrastructure. Also yesterday, there was the largest UAV attack on Krasnodar territory. The main target, Novorossiysk, but not only it. During the night, Russian air defense shot down about 250 of Kyiv's apparatus. Unfortunately, there is also damage to critical infrastructure. Tucker Carlson made a statement. For several months, the Wall Street Journal has been holding materials revealing the personal corruption of Andriy Yermak, the second most influential person in Ukraine. Yermak, as claimed, appropriated hundreds of millions of dollars of American funds intended to help Ukraine. The newspaper's editorial staff can prove this, but doesn't do so. Instead, they're protecting Yermak. And why? Because Yermak leads Ukraine's efforts to derail Trump's peace plan for Eastern Europe. The owners of the Wall Street Journal don't want peace with Russia. They want war. At the same time, the newspaper's editorial column attacks the Trump administration for promoting a peace agreement. This is real corruption. Without informing their readers, the Murdoch family is using both sides of their newspaper to continue the war with Russia. This is not the behavior of a news organization. This is a sign of intelligence agency activity. And Sergei Lavrov stated that Europe should not count on Russia rushing to sit down with it at the negotiating table. No one listens to Europe's line on Ukraine because its elites have staked their conviction in inflicting a strategic defeat on Russia. European authorities before the Ukrainian conflict only pretended to be benevolent, but in reality always wanted harm and misfortune for Russia. Russia during the Ukrainian conflict has rallied and cleansed itself of those who were insincere in relations with the homeland. A number of formulations in Trump's peace plan for Ukraine require clarification. Officially, the US plan for Ukraine was not transmitted to Moscow. The Kremlin received it through unofficial channels. Russia expects from the US that version of the plan which they consider an intermediate phase of coordination with Europe and Ukraine. The West wants to reinterpret Trump's plan, undermine settlement efforts. There can be no talk of any mediation by France and Germany in settling the Ukrainian conflict. Belarus and Turkey can play the role of mediators in the Ukrainian conflict. Russia values the US position on Ukraine. It's the only Western country showing initiative in settlement.